in a debate, what's presupposed is some question or some rule, right, by which we go by these rules to confirm or deny the case, right? And I think what you've missed or tended to miss is that the transcendental argument is not just an argument that's a reductio against some other position. It's a positive argument that's about all of those transcendental categories. And if those transcendental categories are actually necessary, and if they're actually very strong arguments themselves, then the argument for God itself is also strong, and it's also a positive argument. It's not just a negative argument about, well, I can find a flaw in your worldview, therefore mine's true. That's not the totality of the argument. The totality of the argument is that this worldview is coherent because I can look at all those different paradigmatic claims and preconditions, and they make sense, they're coherent. When I look at the system over here, and you can say I don't have a system, you can say, I'm not saying that you said that, but a person could say as a skeptic, I don't have a holistic system, I just have the best that I can go by with maximal certainty and pragmatic approaches. But that still has claims that are necessary and implicit about metaphysics, about epistemology, and about ethics. Even if you don't want to go down any of those specific routes, it still has a necessary implication. If I were to say I'm a total skeptic and I don't think that I know anything is true, that's still a claim about metaphysics, about ethics, and about epistemology, even if I don't want it to go there.
So we're echoing, but the issue here is whether or not there's a God. And you're presenting an argument for the existence of God based on the necessity of an explanation for logic, among other things, or as a foundation for it. My response is, you haven't demonstrated that this is a necessity. You've just asserted that the absence of such an explanation leads to problems, but those problems presuppose that there is an explanation. There's been no demonstration that the laws of logic could have been any other way, or that there's any case that they need some sort of guarantor. And when I try to point this out, you've on a couple of occasions completely misframed what I was talking about. The card example, which I agree is, and I know you didn't raise this objection, but somebody, I'm not watching that, but I'm sure somebody out there was complaining about, this analogy, that's within, the reality, and you can, provide evidence, and it doesn't fit within the transcendental thing. Yes, it's an analogy. I get it. The thing is, it would be a coherent, if you don't know whether or not how you ended up with 13 spades, it would be a coherent explanation to believe that I cheated. Because if you're not sure whether I believe, and you're not sure whether or not I cheated or whether somebody there cheated, then you're in this state of, I don't know. And this is why I was talking about our discomfort with not knowing. I wasn't using it as an emotional fallacy. It's just a fact. We are uncomfortable with not knowing. It's the reason we seek answers. It's the reason why we presuppose in some cases that something may have an answer when we might be wrong about whether or not it has an answer. And so the card cheating example there, of course, if you sit across from me at the table and you get that, almost anybody is going to be tempted to say, wow, I bet somebody cheated, because everything makes a lot more sense if in fact somebody cheated. And that might make you more comfortable rather than not knowing. That maybe, I'm not saying that is the reason for doing it. You can convince yourself in a worldview where Matt cheated, now all of a sudden this outcome makes a lot more sense. And you're right. I acknowledge that at the outset of the debate, at the very beginning. But that has nothing to do with whether or not I actually cheated. That has everything to do with your comfort or discomfort with not knowing. And if you're convinced that I did cheat, then of course that's going to be a satisfying answer. And it would probably be satisfying for almost anybody there, as long as they didn't care whether or not it was actually true. And I care whether or not things are actually true to the best that we can find out. And so I can't make a leap to, oh, there must be a God that serves as a foundation for logic, because I'm not yet convinced that logic needs a foundation.
I see. And I think I see the point of departure now. So basically, where I would disagree, where I think we're talking past, is about the issue of different types of proofs and different types of things. So for example, your analogy is fine when it comes to matters of normative daily life, normative discourse. But when it's issues, I would argue, that are so fundamental and paradigmatic that they destroy the possibility of knowledge or predication or logic, ethics at all, they're different from the kinds of claims or beliefs that we have that speak to what you're talking about with your example. So, for example, if I deny the laws of logic, there's something very fundamental about argumentation, living, speaking, communicating that's completely destroyed, right? If I deny them, if I doubt them, if I don't think they have a true existence, if they're not real, if they're just social constructs, that's a much more damaging thing to doubt than if I doubt that Lil Wayne has moved in next door to me, right? I might see a dude with dreads and I think it's Lil Wayne over there, therefore Lil Wayne has moved. And now, if I'm wrong about that, it doesn't destroy my whole worldview to be wrong about that. If I deny basic laws of logic, it does destroy my whole worldview. And so not everything is proven the exact same way. And so because those kinds of things are much more fundamental, much more powerful and paradigmatic, that's why it's such a strong argument, and that's why they do require a justification. I mean, the argument that you gave about the cards, you are giving a kind of justification. You're saying that we can't always go by the appearances of things, and I would agree with that. But it's different when we're talking about paradigmatic level presuppositions, and that's why transcendentals are different than normative argumentation and logic.
First of all, I don't know how that's special pleading, but going on about the consequences. Oh, you need to mute. Going on about the consequences of denying the laws of logic seems completely irrelevant because I'm not doing that. See, you're trying to argue for a foundation behind the laws of logic. That's the part that I'm denying, but not the laws of logic themselves. And so I would agree, if you deny the laws of logic, then we can't have any kind of conversation. We can't do anything. We are forced essentially to recognize these things, and denial of them would lead to chaos, except that I'm not doing that at all. I am denying your bald assertion that there must be a foundation.
Yeah, but as a skeptic, shouldn't we have a justification for things that we believe in?
Yes. And that's why I've been so strong on pointing out the difference between saying I am convinced of X, I am not convinced of X, and I am convinced of not X. As a skeptic, I want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible. And I proportion my confidence level in what I believe to the available evidence for it, of which for the evidence of a foundation for the logical absolutes, zero evidence. The evidence that God serves as a foundation, zero evidence, as far as I can tell, for any of these things. My position is not the laws of logic are in fact absolute and inviolable, other than they appear to be, and we should operate as if they are until there's such time as there's a demonstration when they're not. These things continually demonstrate. We can't have conversations without them. They are as close to, if they're not absolute, they're as close as I think any of us could possibly imagine. And so my position is not they don't require a foundation, because that would be an assertion that I would have to defend. I'd have a burden of proof. How did you come to the conclusion they don't need a foundation? I didn't come to that conclusion. I am not yet convinced that they do, because I have not, nobody's demonstrated that, and you and I would agree, at least within your worldview, there's at least one thing that does not require a foundation. And so given that, I'm not sure whether or not there's one thing that doesn't require a foundation, or two things that doesn't require a foundation, or zero things that doesn't require a foundation. Those are things that we don't seem to be able to demonstrate.
Well, at that point, I would say that when it comes to the question of demonstration and how that's been used in epistemology and philosophy, I appreciate that admission, because if we're believing in things because they work and they don't have to be justified, that's not skepticism. Skepticism is interested in asking those questions. And I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate the attempt to be consistent, but I don't think that it's ultimately consistent, because you can't just say, well, I don't see why they have to be justified, because that is being arbitrary. It's being ad hoc. And you can say it's not being arbitrary because you don't see a reasoning why it has to be, but that's the whole skeptical truth. That's why skeptics do what they do, is to try to justify claims, to try to justify beliefs, to try to justify systems. And so yes, you could say, we're not going to do that.
We try. And if we don't find a justification, we keep trying. We're still echoing, but yes. So first of all, I'm sure, please, people who watch this later, don't beat Jay up too much for lecturing me about skepticism while arguing on behalf for a God. Skepticism is about wanting your internal model from an idealistic standpoint. Modern scientific scan to match reality. Modern scientific skepticism is about testing as best we can. But that's within the context of testing fact claims about reality. So that modern scientific skepticism isn't going to address whether or not logic has a foundation. You're talking about almost an ancient Greek knowledge of skepticism that has been discarded because it leads to.
Okay. They're the very questions that Hume and Quine asked.
Yeah.
That's not ancient Greece.
They asked questions. They did not assert answers. That's the difference. You're asserting an answer.
William Van Orman Quine's essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, he says that they cannot be logically justified on empiricist grounds. That's why they're called two dogmas of empiricism, according to Quine's famous essay.
Sure.
Hesher?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We want to read some super chats. We're getting towards the last 15, 20 minutes.
All right, yeah. We are into the final segment here. Great discussion, you guys.
It was.
Yeah, let's do that, Jay. Let's. I'm really enjoying it over here. And yeah, Jay, if you have any super chats, I guess now would be a good time to round those out.
Franklin Chan.
As one last clarification, you can say whatever you want about Quine. I'm not beholden to Quine. I'm talking about my thing. And this notion of skepticism, I've already explained it over and over and over again, and you have yet to demonstrate any sort of problem with it, except to assert that I'm not a skeptic in the same way whoever the hell you reference is a skeptic, and I don't care.
Fair enough. Definitely one can take a different track, but I'm just interested in the history of different skeptics and how they talk and what they consider justification and how philosophy and epistemology typically speaks of justifying claims. But
I'm not. I'm interested in what's actually true and demonstrable, which is why we're stuck.
Okay. So we'll go to Franklin Chan. He says, thanks for the debate. Thank you, Franklin. Jolene K says, for the cause. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, Jolene. Michael Flaherty, $100. Thank you, Michael. Finally, a real debate. This is all. Tanner Terry, $2 says, atheism saved. Doorman 360 says, Jay bringing up Hume's argument about induction being unjustifiable in a materialist worldview. Why would today be the same tomorrow for no reason? Yeah, I mean, that's essentially the argument. Tanner Terry, $5. To both debaters, what are the... Go ahead.
Are we going to address some of these?
Sure.
Because some of these, I mean, you know, when I say I don't care what Hume said or Quine said or anybody else, because, you know, I'm going to take pieces from different things, and I'm certainly not as well versed on some of those as they are. I'm talking about what my position is and why. When we talk about induction, we live our entire lives by inference and induction. We begin with this assumption that tomorrow is pretty much going to be like today, because the entire history of the world has continued to show that that's going to be the case. But we also do it with the recognition that tomorrow is not identical to today and that there are trends. So yeah, you know, I don't expect that the Earth's going to stop spinning on its axis in the next 10 minutes. But I do it with the understanding that it's very likely that, and almost certain that it will stop spinning on its axis at some point in the future. And so when we talk about induction, there's a reason it's not deduction, it's an approximation, it is an estimation, it's an inference about what things are going to be like. But that is not the same as wild-ass guessing, I guess, is probably the best way to put that. And it's the reason why we rely on science, despite the fact that science is virtually almost entirely an inductive process.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything that Matt just said. It's just that in the history of this debate that I'm bringing up, the question of justifying the belief in induction, the entire history of skepticism and empiricism, and from what I understand, Matt is an empiricist, at least to some degree. The whole point of Quine's essay, I'm not saying that Matt has to agree with everything Quine argues, but that Quine restated the argument from the time of Hume that it's a belief that can't be justified, and it's a belief that undergirds science. So the point is that science believes in things that cannot be logically justified. Therefore, the transcendental argument is the next logical step, and that's what I've been trying to argue throughout the debate. Tanner Terry, $5. To both debaters, what is the consequence of one's epistemology breaking down due to incoherence with their view of metaphysics and axiology?
I don't know that there is. Well, one of the consequences is that if I'm wrong, then, no, actually that's not even it. So if my epistemology breaks down, I'd have to know in what way it broke down to know the consequences, because my position is not The logical absolutes don't have a foundation. It's that I'm not aware of one or a need for one. If it turns out that somebody was able to demonstrate that there is a need for one, that doesn't crush my worldview. All it does is add something that I have yet to be convinced of. I become convinced of something new. And so my worldview changes all the time, every time I become convinced of something new across the board. And if there was a further demonstration that, for example, not only do they have a foundation, but it is a God, and in particular, the God of the Orthodox Christian tradition, well, then I would no longer be an atheist, because I would have to be convinced that the Orthodox Christian model of God was real. It may not change my view on that being, like, I'm never going to worship as out of an obligation or an expectation, because I think that any being that would be deserving of worship could never demand it, because that, at least to my understanding, would put it in a position where it would no longer be deserving. But that's kind of off the track. But as far as I redefined knowledge, and I'm sure I'll get beaten up for this, but I had so many conversations about the nature of belief and knowledge, and how knowledge is a subset of belief. And there were people like, no, beliefs are a subset of knowledge. No, you're wrong. Knowledge is a subset of beliefs. They're the things you believe, and then there's some subset of that you count as knowledge. And by and large, in a colloquial sense, when people talk about knowledge, not in a philosophical sense, because there you get to justify true belief, and now there's arguments over what's justified and what's true. In a colloquial sense, when people say I know something, and they're not just talking about like familiarity or awareness, but they're talking about knowledge in the sense of epistemology, all they're really doing, from my experience, is expressing a confidence level. They're saying, I really, 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 really believe it. And so my working definition of knowledge was to say, belief is anything that you are convinced is true or likely true. And knowledge are those beliefs that, if you were to find out you were wrong, it would be dramatically worldview altering. You know, if I can claim to know, I don't know, whether or not my phone is turned on. But what I'm really saying is I'm confident my phone is still turned on because I haven't turned it off yet, and I know the battery is pretty full, and there's lots of good reasons. And so I would argue that my confidence level is really high, and I know this. But I'm not saying I can't be wrong. And that's a fundamental difference, because if in philosophy it's justified true belief, and it turns out it's not true that my phone is on, then I could never count it as knowledge. And I don't think that's the way most of us use knowledge when we're talking about it in general. So I just went with knowledge are those things we believe so strongly that if we were to find out they were wrong, it would be worldview altering. And if I don't have a position, like if I'm not convinced that, if I had a view that the laws of logic do not require a foundation, then yes, that would be worldview altering to find out it was wrong. But that's not my position. My position is not being convinced of something.
It's the same for God.
It's the same for God. I'm not depending on God, I may be convinced that a God doesn't exist, depending on how it's defined. But generally speaking, I'm just not convinced that there is one.
Right. I would reply to the question, what are the consequences of one's epistemology breaking down due to incoherence in their view of metaphysics and axiology? I would say it's devastating. If the arguments and the positions that you're stating are so fundamentally unjustifiable, right? I mean, if I can't give an account for things in a philosophic and a logical, reasonable sense, which is often what we're required to do. This was so kind of ironic is in this kind of a debate, is that it's always pressed upon the theist, which fair enough. Yeah, we are making pretty grandiose claims, right? So we ought to be able to logically give an account, give a justification for those kinds of claims. And I think that the transcendental argument is the case. It is the argument for the existence of God. And so it is pretty consistent with a coherence type of view in terms of epistemology. So I would say that if one makes a fundamental paradigmatic flaw in one's epistemology, then their worldview and their system completely breaks down and is incoherent. Like, for example, if I say, I don't believe that there's an external world, right, or something like this would be so fundamental. If I don't believe that there's logic, right, that would be so fundamental that our whole system would collapse. And again, historically, nobody's had a problem asking, can we investigate and justify these kinds of claims? And I know that Matt's not saying that you can't ask those things, but he's saying that he's not convinced that there is a need to justify those kinds of claims and those kinds of positions. And again, I still think that it's arbitrary to say that I don't know and they don't require it, because if you're going to utilize things, if you're going to believe in things and act as if those things are the case, there's nothing wrong with me in a debate asking for the justification for those kinds of things, because it's the same kind of question that you would ask about a theist. Now, the argument is that, and Matt many times said, but you're saying that God is circular and you don't have to give a justification for God. I'm saying that the justification for God is the transcendental argument, and all systems ultimately are circular at their root. Yes, absolutely. Because you can never ultimately get past some final authority, right? But to say that that's not an argument, I think just flatly incorrect. It is an argument. It's a transcendental argument, and transcendental arguments are valid arguments. Now, again, one could deny that, but the fact that if we deny transcendental arguments leads us to absurdities, that's the reductio, right? And that would prove that they are valid arguments in a logical sense, if something leads to a reductio, right?
Well, if you do this again, maybe putting tag in a syllogism that can be addressed, okay, maybe we can get closer to an argument. But the is that for like the third time now, just a second ago, if you rewind, you were saying that that you think there was a problem with saying I don't know, and they don't. Hang on. When you were talking about whether or not the absolutes had a foundation, you said you think there's a problem with saying I don't know and they don't require it. I don't see any problem with saying I don't know. I don't say it's because that's almost always the right answer. I don't see any problem with asking a question, but at no point did I say they don't require it, which is, once again, you're still phrasing this as it, and I know you weren't necessarily directing at me, they were talking in general about a problem. I would agree with you. Anybody who says the laws of logic don't require justification has adopted a burden of proof that I don't know how they could ever meet, and certainly nobody's ever done it. Saying they don't require it is a claim. Saying I'm not convinced they do is not a claim that they don't.
Yeah, but you utilize the things that you say you don't know if they require a justification.
Yes. As a pragmatic sense, because they continue to work, and you utilize the same things. The one thing you utilize that I don't, you don't utilize the laws of logic.
I'm saying that when you say that you do it because it's pragmatic and it works, that's not a coherent response as to how that's not a coherent justification. Just because something works,
you're confusing whether or not it works with how it works or why it works.
That you can't know. Saying that something works presupposes a category of value judgments to say that this is working, this is not working, this is good, this is bad.
Yes,
right. And those are metaphysical beliefs and claims and truths.
It's truth, which is what I talked about at the very beginning. That's the only thing that I'm presupposing here. When I talk about using the laws of logic because they're pragmatic, we both use them, and we are in agreement that they are the reliable method, and apparently seem to be inviolate. That's the thing, that point we agree on. You are now utilizing something that I don't use, which is a God as a foundation for them. That's the point at which we disagree. And what you seem to be saying is that unless I can provide an explanation for why they work, I cannot have any reasonable expectation that they are in fact working. And that's a crock, because I don't need to know how my car works to know whether or not it's working. I don't need to know how we got to the moon to know whether or not we actually got to the moon. And logic, the laws of logic are something that all of us, well, you and I at least, let's not speak for everybody on the planet, we're in agreement of what they are and that they work. And so there's no way to criticize somebody for using something that works just by saying you don't know how it works. Well, I'm not convinced that you know either.
Yeah, but again, it's a very specific and different question. And I appreciate the honesty of saying that you don't know that it can be justified. And I want to phrase it right so I don't misstate you, that you don't know that it's possible and you don't know that it can be justified. But I think that's a weakness in the approach and the argumentation, because as a skeptic, you ought to be able to be asked that question, and it's not an unfair question, because if you're going,
I am. And the correct answer is, you can ask me whatever question you want as a skeptic, and you can ask, what is your justification for why the laws of logic seem reliable? And my answer is, I don't know, because that is the proper skeptical response. You keep, as a skeptic, you must do X. And I'm sitting here telling you, no, that's not what skepticism is in the way that I and most modern skeptics would use it. Because you can ask me, what's your justification for this? And my answer is, I don't know. Because if modern skepticism is about anything, and I'll talk about this in the Magic and Skepticism show at Dragon Con and wherever else, it is about recognizing our discomfort with saying I don't know, and how that is plaguing us to make logical mistakes and make fallacious leaps because, as I pointed out before, our discomfort with not knowing, when most of the time I don't know is actually the right answer. And the fact that that answer isn't satisfying to people is just too damn bad. If it's the right answer, the fact that it doesn't satisfy, it's frustrating. I know, because as kids, you know, when you ask your parents why and they say because I said so, that's a crappy answer. I mean, that's completely dissatisfying. That's never appealing to anybody. And what I see from Tag and others is basically a because I said so, only the I is God. It doesn't explain anything to us. The God has no the God concept has no explanatory power.
No, it absolutely does, and I've been arguing this whole time how it does. It does because of the fact that there's a whole bunch of transcendental categories that are not material that we all presuppose, that we all utilize. You talk about utilizing the concept of truth as a presupposition, but you don't know and you can't say if it's actually out there. That is a fundamental sophistry and absurdity. You can't utilize these things. You can do it, but you're doing it because the worldview of atheism is not true. That's the argument. And you could say that's not an argument, that's fine. But it is an argument, and it's a very powerful argument, because all of these transcendental categories are used. And to say that they're not real and they can't be justified, well.
I didn't say that they weren't real, and I didn't say they can't be justified. This is like the 18th time you've used that phrasing. It's you don't even understand what skepticism is, and you don't seem to understand
what skepticism is. I studied it intensely in grad school. I argued with, I debated skeptical professors. I know what skepticism is. And you can keep qualifying it and saying that, well, I just don't know. And I understand that in many, in a sense, it's fine to take the approach of being willing to be corrected, being willing to say, I don't know. But that's different than being asked about justifying claims. And a debate is about justifying beliefs and claims, is it not?
Well, you're making a claim which you have to justify, and I'm explaining why I don't accept it. I'm not making
But you are. That's the thing that you don't understand. You are. No, you are.
You're absolutely.
You can say I'm not, but you logically necessarily do. That's what you don't get.
No, this is why I explained the difference between saying I'm convinced that you're innocent versus I'm not convinced that you're guilty. What claim did I make about the logical absolutes other than I am not convinced that they need a foundation?
You claim that they work and you can use them, but they don't, and perhaps cannot be justified. You don't think that's a metaphysical claim?
I don't know whether or not they can be justified, but claiming that they work is something that that you agree with.
But is that a metaphysical truth claim in any sense?
Is it a well, under the presuppositions that I listed, that I'm presupposing truth and a reality and those absolutes, then yes, those are all entailed in there. My objection is that you are going.
That's what I'm trying to say.
So, I meant what?
You admit that there's logical entailment in even saying that I use these things, but I don't know if they can be justified. That's still claiming things about metaphysics and epistemology.
No. I'm saying they're presuppositions, which by definition are not justified. If they were justified, we wouldn't freaking presuppose them.
No, that's not true.
That's
not true. That's to say that there's no such thing as a transcendental argument. What the hell is a presupposition? If we have a justification for something, we don't need to presuppose it. That's not right. That's why you don't understand what a transcendental argument is. It is a logical form of argumentation. For example, let me give an example from mathematics. I mean, you can disagree with them, but the denial of that kind of an argumentation is what leads to the absurdity.
I deny it. I don't know. We should probably go back to some more super chat, because you and I are not speaking the same language at all. I didn't deny that this wasn't an argument or logical. Okay. Anyway.
Midwave Productions, 50 SEK. Question for Matt. Is your belief that God doesn't exist rational or determined? Is your response to this question rational or determined?
When did I say so? Wow, this is the frustrating thing. Matt, is your belief that God doesn't exist? When did I express that? Because I'm not convinced that a God. First of all, we need to define a God. What God are you talking about? Which God? Because there are some gods which, by virtue of them conflicting with observations from reality, and I think we can be reasonably confident, those gods don't exist. If you say that your God makes the sky pink 24/7, well, the sky's not pink 24/7, and so there's a conflict either with whether or not that God exists or whether or not your understanding that God is the same thing. My position is I am not convinced that a God exists. So when you frame it as if I'm asserting that there isn't a God and then asking whether or not it's rational, well, it depends entirely on which God we're talking about and whether or not I do actively believe that that God doesn't exist.
Yeah, I don't think that there is such a position as a skeptical neutrality that Matt would like to have. I know that in an existential sense, Matt takes the position of skeptical neutrality, but I don't think that he understands that even that position necessitates logical claims and metaphysical claims and claims about justifying things whether he wants it to or not. That's what I think is the disparity here.
Jay, do you believe I have $1,000 in my wallet right now?
I don't know.
Do you believe that I don't have $1,000 in my wallet right now?
I don't believe either claim.
Okay, thanks for refuting your own point from a moment ago.
Correct, but that's at the normative level of interactions and not at the paradigmatic level.
And that's special.
See, that's two
And
different
that's special
things.
pleading.
That's two different things. No,
Yeah,
that's what I've been
special
arguing. That's
pleading.
not special pleading because the whole time I've been arguing for transcendental categories and arguments, not normative logical claims.
Yeah, it's called special pleading. You're claiming the transcendental arguments are special, so they don't have to apply.
You just
the
said
normal
a minute ago
argument,
that they're presupposed and that they're different.
I said that they're presupposed. That's with respect to whether or not they can be justified, not whether or not they are fundamentally different and whether they follow. Like if you everything is derived from logic once you presuppose that as the
Don't
foundation.
you think that there's something if I deny the laws of logic, that's more fundamental than whether I'm wrong about the $1,000 in your pocket or Lil Wayne living next door to me? Isn't one of those more fundamentally damaging to a worldview?
Yes.
Then you
Yes.
admit the point. That's the whole point that I'm making about what a transcendental is and why it's so more fundamentally paradigmatic.
I agree that two things are different. I don't agree that your explanation. Oh, sorry, I'm getting time to take the trash out. I don't agree that your claim that because they're different, they're no longer subject to reason or the sort of epistemic warrant. The fact that we presuppose something is because we can't justify it. Currently, maybe you're offering a justification and a justification without any epistemic warrant.
No, I'm not. It does have epistemic warrant.
Okay.
I mean, the epistemic warrant is the arguments I've been making for the last 2 hours. Let's move on. So the next one is Admiral Squat Bar. He says $2. Jay, scooch away from the mic and the speakers. Okay, I'm trying. John DeFranco, $10. Thank you, John. Vitaly Khmelski, $5. His argument essentially actually proves God. Every supposition is based on Christian philosophy, whether he knows it or not. That is the transcendental argument in summation, correct?
That's a bald-ass assertion. So if that's what the transcendental argument is, then congratulations. It's not an argument. It's an assertion.
Well, it's a summation of what the transcendental argument is in a proposition, but not every proposition isn't. Not every assertion is false or not.
Actually,
It's a summation of the argument. It does require fleshing.
It's a double assertion. This assertion that I'm not aware of it, the number of times today that it's been suggested that I'm just, an ignorant buffoon today is rather staggering, which is why I've